If you've considered buying a third-party lens for your Hasselblad X2D from brands like Leica, Voigtlander or TTArtisan, then this video is for you. In it, I'm going to explain what camera settings to change on your X2D, which adapters I use, and the best way to use these lenses for great results, including how to deal with the limitations that these lenses impose. Now, I've owned my X2D for about 6 months. If you own one yourself, you'll probably know about the global stock shortages on their superb but very pricey XCD lenses. Now, I'm not used to waiting so long for a lens, so to quell my impatience, I bought a collection of non-native lenses from Leica, Voigtlander and TTArtisan, just to see how they'd perform on the X2D. These lenses included the Voigtlander M-mount 50mm APO f2.0 with an adapter, the Voigtlander M-mount 21mm f1.4 also with an adapter, the TTArtisan XCD mount 90mm f1.25, no adapter required, the Leica R mount 80-200 f4 with an adapter, brilliant lens that one, and the Leica R mount 180mm f2.8 also with an adapter. That one's a really good lens. Okay, so before you use any of the currently available non-native lenses on the X2D, whether from TTArtisan, Voigtlander, Leica or Zeiss, there are 3 things that you need to do with your X2D to make it work and to get the best user experience. First, you must enable the electronic shutter because unlike native XCD lenses, none of these third-party lenses contain a shutter mechanism inside them, only an aperture ring and a focus ring. A few things to note about setting electronic shutter on your X2D. First, it's completely silent, so you won't hear anything when you click the shutter. Second, although it can go up to 6,000th of a second, its readout speed remains slow at just 1/3 of a second. That means that A, you can't reliably shoot moving objects, and B, you mustn't move the camera for 1/3 of a second after clicking the shutter button. Now, if you change your camera's bit depth from 16-bit to 14-bit, it'll take about 1/6 of a second for the readout across the sensor to finish, which it's better, but still slow. Next, you'll need to change it back from electronic shutter to mechanical shutter when you do attach or reattach a native Hasselblad XCD lens if you own any. Now, the second thing that you should do is manually set the focal length for image stabilisation. That way, you can still take advantage of the X2D's amazing 5-axis 7-stop in-body image stabilisation with a non-native lens. Now, according to Hasselblad, this works on lenses up to 499mm, but I've found that it starts getting pretty clunky and noisy once you get over 300mm. The third thing I'd recommend is optimizing your camera for manual focus, since all these third-party lenses are manual focus only. Now, you can do this by going to your focus settings and setting MF Assist to focus peaking and the peaking color to cyan, which I found is most visible in most scenes. I'd also consider setting your top-mounted ISO white balance button to the zoom in function so that you can quickly zoom into a scene to perfect your focus before hitting the shutter button. This I find works really well. Once you hit the shutter button, it will zoom back out again. Now, you can customize the ISO white balance button by going to General, Custom Buttons, ISO white balance, and then selecting Zoom In. M-mounted lenses like my Voigtlander 21 and 50 need an adapter to use them on the X2D. I've used TTArtisan's M to X1D adapter on their 50mm 0.95 lens, which I've been testing recently, and the Novoflex adapter on my 2 Voigtlander lenses. With the 2 Leica R mount lenses, I use the Fotodiox Pro Adapter, and it too works just fine. There's no electronic contact between the lenses and the camera body with these adapters, so you'll be shooting in either manual or aperture priority mode. In other words, M or A mode on the X2D. Now, if I'm shooting handheld, I tend to shoot in A mode with the ISO set to auto ISO. The X2D decides what ISO to set based on the minimum shutter speed that I've told it that I'll accept when using auto ISO. You can set this minimum shutter speed within the X2D's exposure settings in the main menu. I've set mine to half the focal length, which means that half the currently set focal length is the minimum shutter speed. However, that only works when you have a Hasselblad XCD lens attached. So for non-XCD lenses, like the ones we're talking about today, I set my minimum shutter speed to around 4 stops below the focal length that I'd manually set for image stabilisation. Bear in mind, this minimum shutter speed setting only applies to aperture priority mode. It's irrelevant if you're shooting in M or manual mode. So for a 50mm lens like the TTArtisan or the Voigtlander lenses that I've got, I set it to never go lower than 1/4 of a second, which allows for around 4 stops of image stabilisation below the shutter speed at which IBIS wouldn't normally be needed. In other words, 50th of a second with a 50mm focal length. For the Leica 180mm lens, I'd set the minimum shutter speed to a 15th of a second. For the Voigtlander 21mm lens, around about 1 second. I then use the rear thumb wheel to set my exposure compensation when I'm shooting. The alternative to all this is to simply shoot manually and set your aperture on the lens and the shutter speed with the rear dial and the ISO on the touchscreen. For most people, this probably makes more sense. It's important to understand that M-mount and R-mount lenses are designed to cover a full frame sensor, not the medium format sensor that you find in the X2D or the X1D. That means there will be vignetting, and vignetting means you'll need to crop your images a little bit. There are 2 ways I do this. In camera, I often use the 1:1 or X-pan crops, which, depending on the aperture you set, will show either a really soft vignette or a medium to hard vignette at the very edges. The other way I do it is in post, using Photoshop or something similar using the crop tool. When you use these lenses, you'll see the size and hardness of the vignetting in real time when you're composing the image, because the aperture is fully manual, meaning you stop the lens down, the aperture blades physically close down the sides of the iris diaphragm. What you set is what you see, and what you see is what you'll get in the image. And that brings me on to focusing. If you plan to shoot an image at a smaller aperture, like say f/16, I recommend doing your focusing at a much wider aperture, like say f2, first, so you can see the effects of your focus adjustments much more clearly, then stop back down to your smaller aperture that you intended to shoot with when you shoot the image. This way, you'll see your subject snap into focus much more definitively, unlike focusing at f/16, where the transition between in focus and out of focus areas is much harder to see. An alternative is to use zone focusing, where, depending on the lens, you look at the depth of field scale on the barrel of the lens to see how much of your image will be in focus at a given aperture. On this 50mm lens, for example, setting the aperture to f/16 and the focus ring in this position shows that everything from about 3 meters away to infinity should be in focus. Here's what I typically do when I compose an image with a manual lens on the X2D. First, I set my aperture. Second, I set my shutter speed and ISO if shooting on M, or optional exposure compensation if shooting on A. 3, I compose my frame and focus, taking note of any vignetting. 4, I zoom in and refine focus using the button that I customized earlier. And 5, I set my final aperture if I had opened it up before to refine focus, finalize my exposure, and then press the shutter, being sure not to move for 1/3 of a second afterwards. This method might seem like a bit of a faff, but it quickly becomes second nature and it'll yield the best results for you. Here are some images I shot with each of the lenses mentioned in this video. So if you've bought into the X system but don't want to spend multiples of the body price on lenses, it is possible to get exceptional results with other brands, providing you accept their limitations and set your camera up accordingly. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye-bye.